Medicine Leads the Way is an address by Robert Welch, founder of the John Birch Society, before the section on general practice of the Los Angeles County Medical Association in the 1960s. It outlines the history of the moves to install compulsory health care on the populations of Europe and America. It documents a hidden agenda behind the humanitarian facade of providing health care for citizens. Some nuances in the progression towards socialized medicine have changed since the speech was delivered, but they do not affect the overall message. In addition, since the destruction of the various intelligence agencies in the Senate and House of Representatives, we no longer have the capability to identify contemporary American socialist personalities. Sadly, the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association are no longer the bulwarks against socialized medicine as they were in the 1960s. Within the message is also a very important segment on the use of the desire of the people for security, for government to offer security as a means to ultimately control their own citizens.
This was when I was first getting started. I was making a speech way up in Maine, in what we call the Down East country. They had a very nice roast beef dinner, and I sat through it and didn't eat anything. And the Toastmaster asked me why, and I explained that I thought I could do a better job if I didn't fill my stomach full of food. So when he got up to introduce me, he pointed out what a conscientious speaker they had, and that I had not eaten anything so that I could expect to do a better job in my speech. So I went ahead and made my speech and got through, and there was perfunctory applause. And I saw an old Down East Yankee that I knew quite well over in the audience. And so as soon as I could get a chance, I said, "Now look, tell me truthfully, how did I do?" He looked at me quizzically for a minute and scratched his head, and he said, "Well, you could have ate." So, because of the way that the medical needs of a population have been used by the social planners as an excuse, an entering wedge for their planning, that I was so glad to have this opportunity of speaking with you tonight. And I'm not going to waste that opportunity by arguing with you, either pro or con, about such matters as the Kerr-Mills bill or the King-Anderson bill or the Foran bill, or any of the recent or current legislation and programs and proposals of the immediate scene. Everything in all of these bills constitutes merely varying stages of implementation of the central and overall planning of the International Labor Office, set forth in its recommendations concerning medical care in its official bulletin issued June the 1st, 1944, whereby the International Socialists would gradually and eventually convert all physicians, such as yourselves, into simply skilled workers in the employ of the government. And I put that in quotes because it's a direct quote from what they have said they want to do. I want you to stand off with me tonight and take a longer and clearer look at the whole ages-old and worldwide panorama, of which these minutiae on the American medical scene are only a tiny and ephemeral part. Let's begin by realizing that there have been two great struggles throughout all human history. One is between good and evil. The other is between individualism and collectivism. There have been and are plenty of good people who support collectivist theories and plenty of bad people who oppose them. For too many of the idealists, the good people simply refuse to read enough history or to look at the whole matter objectively enough to become aware that the actual and practical result of the drive towards collectivism always has been, is, and always will be tyranny. And when power-seeking criminals seize control of this so-called progressive or liberal movement and convert it into a juggernaut type of vehicle for gaining personal tyrannical power, you find every crime and all of the forces of evil brought into play in alliance with the misguided idealists to hasten and increase the tyranny to which collectivism inevitably leads. Just for an illustration, there is no question, ladies and gentlemen, but that today the trade in narcotics and the distribution of pornography, normally crimes that are anti-government and the government at least pretends to oppose. There's no question but that today they are both controlled by the international communist conspiracy and are utilized by this conspiracy in our country and everywhere else in the world to obtain money for the conspiracy and for some of its governments to break down the morality of populations opposing the conspiracy, and for many other purposes which serve the needs of that conspiracy. In other words, the two struggles between good and evil and between individualism and collectivism have today become almost one and the same struggle, having been made that way through seizure by vicious criminals of both the ideology and the organizations of the collectivist drive to serve this worldwide criminal organization's unrelenting and ruthless push for power. So, even in this long sweeping survey of one continuing problem, let's pass over such drives towards disastrous collectivism as reached great momentum under Pericles in Greece, or as began the final destruction of the Roman Empire under Diocletian and Constantine, and give our attention to the huge new drive of our own era. And now the moving drive towards collectivism, of which we are now feeling such a mighty impact, can be said, I believe, to have had at least its visible beginning in the last half of the 18th century. In fact, there was one terrific, even though rather temporary, flash or explosion resulting from and revealing these forces at work in the French Revolution, which telescoped into about 6 years, from 1789 to 1795, practically every single thing in the way of ideology, methods, excesses, cruelties, and resulting chaos which our contemporary communists are bringing about in the course of approximately 6 decades. And on a scale as much more extensive in space as in time, since this drive now reaches over the whole planet, instead of being confined almost to a single city, as the French Revolution was, especially since the years of the French Revolution, when the collectivists received such a shattering setback, the powers in control of organizing and promoting this modern collectivist drive have worked almost entirely in the dark and behind the scenes. But the ideological front which they have pushed ahead of themselves, and the implementation of ideological claims and theories which would enable them gradually to begin to seize and then to build up toeholds of political power and of support from public opinion, these steps of patient but sure progress in the whole long collectivist drive became increasingly visible throughout the 19th century, especially in Europe and primarily in Germany from 1815 on. The setback to the collectivists at the end of the French Revolution was so great. It took about 20 years for there to begin to be any recovery in the collectivist drive at all. But from 1815 on, you begin to see signs of its patient but sure progress all of the time. The first huge milestone in this movement was the work of Karl Marx. And we can assign a definite date to the real beginning of his influence in the movement with the publication of the Communist Manifesto prepared by Friedrich Engels and himself, out of the works of others, but with a lot of their own ideas added, which publication took place in 1848. There are a lot of lesser milestones during the 19th century which should be carefully noted. But as it is, I think we'd better move right along to the next one of tremendous importance, which is the first real crystallization of any of the theories of the modern collectivists, whom we now call the Marxists, more in some cases for convenience than for accuracy, the crystallization of their clouds of theories into the reins of actual legislation which began in Germany in the 1880s, with the enactment of the first important legislation in the huge but gradual development which thus began in 1884. And this brings us back to medicine, to the reasons for my making this speech, and to one justification for the title of such speech, which is Medicine Leads the Way. January 1st, 1884, Bismarck's compulsory health insurance became effective in Germany. This legislation not only implemented a whole new concept of the function of government, but by its very nature, and especially by the complexities involved in its administration, it supplied an excuse for and even made inevitable a mushrooming of both the power and extensiveness of this bureaucracy in our modern states. Once you have government obligated or empowered to decide whether or not any one of its millions of citizens really is sick, and to what amount of benefits that citizen is thereby entitled under so-called, quote, insurance, unquote, provisions, as they did in Germany beginning in January 1884. There were 7 different breakdowns and divisions and departments or agencies through which this compulsory health insurance and its benefits were handled. Once you have that situation, you have already wiped out all practicable limits to the extent to which government may be authorized to interfere with or try to control every detail of our individual lives. In all this clot of legislation, Bismarck, of course, was stealing the socialists' thunder in order to use it for his own purposes, namely as a basis for a political alliance between the top and the bottom of the social structure of the German Empire, at the expense of the rising industrial class and the intelligent middle class, which might otherwise offer more resistance. In 1884, there was already an international clique at work with an amount of organization and control which cannot now be determined, but even with certain heads already sticking up visibly out of this matrix, to create the atmosphere and bring about the pressures which would gradually spread such legislation and all of its cousins and allies and their offspring all over the world. So that in 1911, under the famous liberal prime minister and infamous hypocrite which he was, David Lloyd George, a very similar act became the law in England. The same or quite similar legislation was then gradually introduced into other countries. And the great effort to impose national compulsory health insurance on ourselves began with the Murray-Wagner-Dingle bills, and particularly with the huge, carefully planned, and extremely dirty drive to get the second of these bills passed by the 79th Congress in 1945, to all of which we shall come back briefly later. That almost every form of collectivism and extension of bureaucratic interference with and control over our lives is sold to a people, to whatever extent it really is sold and not simply imposed on them by ruthless force and cunning. It's always sold to them on the grounds of humanitarianism. And where can you possibly find a humanitarian appeal, at the same time more heartrending and more widespread in its reach, than to take care of the sick who do not have the means to take care of themselves? Also, it is logical and almost necessary for some of the protection and assistance provided by government in this situation to be assistance in kind rather than in money. That is, in actual services to be determined and regulated rather than simply in currency or funds. Or at least the whole program supplies the convincing excuse for government to find ways to take such steps, so that the opportunity thus offered for government and its increasing army of bureaucrats to get themselves more intimately involved in the details of individual lives and in making decisions for individual citizens, it's far greater than in almost any other medium of supposed benevolence through which a paternalistic government could try to establish and increase the number, reach, and insidiousness of its creeping bureaucratic tentacles. There is no question but that such collectivists as Ferdinand Lassalle and Beatrice and Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw and David Lloyd George and James Ramsay MacDonald, to say nothing of those who were more directly in the Marxian orbit, understood pretty well what they were doing by its very specificness. Compulsory health insurance and all of the arguments behind it and measures that went with it were far more useful than even general programs for the supposed alleviation of poverty. And the fact that many of the people I have named, though not all, would have been horrified at the idea of a police state to which the program they thus instituted was bound eventually to lead their respective nations if their spiritual allies and successors continued to carry that program forward. So it was medicine which led the way, not through any fault of medicine, nor of those who practice medicine, but simply because of various aspects of medicine in the whole sociological field, which offered so many advantages to the planners and plotters of collectivism. From this beginning of physical implementation, the whole modern collectivist drive mushrooms and divides, so that we shall be considering only one part of it henceforth, but an extremely important and torch-bearing part nevertheless. And in this part, the next important date, it seems to me, is 1919. While the ostensible, immediate, practical purpose of the ILO was supposed to be to look after the interests of the poor rug weavers in Iran or the vagrant seamen on the merchant ships which plied the Pacific, this was all little more than a front from the very beginning for the tremendous contribution the ILO was to make to the international collectivist drive. Both the direction and the implementation of the drive began to take clear shape in 1927 when the ILO, among other socialist plans and proposals, brought forth its blueprint for the socialization and nationalization of medical practice all over the world. And members of the ILO and its staff began actually to write the legislation and plan the strategy for introducing purely socialized medicine into one country after another. Here again, in this whole gigantic program of total socialism, it was fully realized that measures having to do with medicine and putting every detail of the practice of medicine completely in the hands of the state would be in most cases the easiest to introduce of all programs anywhere near as far-reaching in their effect. For Lenin himself had stated emphatically that socialized medicine was the keystone in the arch of the socialist state. And by 1927, all of the leaders in the ILO had come to realize that Lenin was right. It later boasted that its whole national health program, including every aspect of socialized medicine, had been adopted by Soviet Russia in the early 30s. It was the ILO program, lock, stock, and barrel, and almost as a complete package, which was early adopted by 2 or 3 Central and South American countries, in 1938 by New Zealand, at the same time by Australia, and it was the ILO plan in substance which the British adopted as their national health program, which became effective in that country on July 5th, 1948. And although the French system has some important differences, and there are deviations of various kinds and degrees in the systems of other countries, most of the nations of Europe, even on our side of the Iron Curtain, now have socialized medicine apparatuses which fit reasonably well into the general overall plan which ILO had designed and intended to be applicable to the whole world. In the merging of all the nations of the world into and under a one-world centralized tyranny, with even the minutest details of the internal affairs of what are now these separate nations to be ruthlessly controlled and administered from this one central government, all of which is what the communists definitely plan and towards which they are making great strides. In bringing this about, there will not be any sufficient differences in the national health programs of these various original units to cause any administrative difficulties. And in fact, the whole socialized medicine framework will serve as a cohesive net, mightily helping the one central tyranny to spread and enforce its controls everywhere and with respect to all activities besides medical services. And medicine will truly have led the way. In the meantime, there was a very serious delay from the point of view of the ILO, but a very fortunate one from the point of view of all patriotic Americans in the carrying forward of this program in our country. For this delay, there have been 2 major reasons. One was that the top-level international socialists, working on their own and before the ILO was founded, had not been able to impose even compulsory health insurance on the United States as the first step in their program, and as they had done in Germany, and then in Germany in 1884, and then in England as early as 1911, and then in many other countries. So they did not even have the physical foundation laid from which to advance towards a national health program on full scale. And the second reason for still more delay was that the United States, very wisely having recovered from its international socialist jag under Woodrow Wilson and his boss Edward Mandell House, in time to refuse to have anything to do with the League of Nations, the United States had never been a member of the so-called International Labor Office, And so for 15 years, the ILO was extremely handicapped. And not until 1934, when Francis Perkins, Henry Wallace, and Henry Morgenthau persuaded President Roosevelt to have the United States become a member of the ILO, not until then did the ILO have any chance to go to work effectively within our boundaries. But its members and allies did pour in then, in 1934 and 35, largely from and through Montreal, and largely getting themselves jobs on the payroll of our newly established Social Security Department. The real drive towards socialized medicine in America began in that year. I might add that there had been an effort, a very strong effort, to introduce compulsory health insurance right into our original Social Security Act and program. And President Roosevelt himself thought it was too dangerous, going too far, would frighten the American people too much, and had it taken out. The real drive towards socialized medicine began in America in that year, 1934, when we joined the ILO. But for many reasons, including the good sense and firm stand of the American Medical Association, and then the arrival of World War II, no specific and tangible effort of any real importance got underway until the first of the Murray Wagner Dingle bills was presented in 1943. There had been a preliminary bill presented, if I remember correctly, by Congressman Wagner alone in 1939, but it didn't get anywhere. 1943, the first of the Murray Wagner Dingle bills didn't get very far either, sort of rehearsal and preparation. And the strength of the drive was neither apparent nor felt until the effort to pass the second of these Murray Wagner Dingle bills in 1945. This legislation was, of course, to provide national compulsory health insurance as the base from which to move thereafter. And it is something of which all America, its medical profession in particular, can be proud, that even as late as 1945, the International Socialists had not been able and were not able to establish even this base of compulsory health insurance. The International Socialists were far more aware of the extent of this delay and of the sad lack of this base for all of their activities than anybody else. We believe that the whole ILO crowd, with all of the preparation they had made and all of the support they had from the administration, did believe that they could win this fight in this country at that time. In the first place, none of the Murray Wagner Dingle bills were written by Senator Murray or Congressman Wagner or Congressman Dingle or by any members of their staffs. They were written by Isidore Falk and Arthur Altmeyer. Mr. Altmeyer was chairman and Mr. Falk was director for research and statistics of our Social Security Board, enjoying good federal salaries in those capacities. But these jobs were, of course, incidental to their real purposes. Both were and long had been also important officials of the International Labor Organization. Now, when the first bill of this nature had been introduced by Congressman Wagner alone, if I remember correctly, in 1939, it had drawn very little attention. There had been some fight behind the first of the combination bills in 43, but with no real chance or expectation of success. But in 1945, the ILO crowd certainly did not seem to leave anything to chance which they could control. For instance, they had this Murray Wagner Dingle bill introduced simultaneously into both the House and the Senate, same day, on November 19, 1945. And on that very day, they had the then President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, deliver a special message on a proposed long-range national health program for the United States. Some of the falsehoods put out by the propagandists for this measure as to the inadequate supply of physicians and of dentists, as to the number of our boys who had been turned down by draft boards because of medical defects due to lack of medical service, and some of the falsehoods and propaganda as to all kinds and other kinds of other matters, including a supposed serious lack of sufficient hospital beds, were utterly unsupportable by the facts which were clearly on the record. But it was the trickery and stage management with regard to the legislative process where the conniving tactics of the ILO crowd were really manifested. Although the estimated expenditure required by the bill was to be $3 or $4 billion, any provision for raising the money was deliberately omitted, so that the bill would not be referred to the House Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee, but to Senator Murray's own Education and Labor Committee instead. of which he was chairman. And not only was this very much by design, but the pro-communist newspaper PM, established by Marshall Field, publicly gloated over this cute trick. And then every conceivable device was used to weight the appearances before this committee and the publicity regarding these appearances in favor of the bill. Senator Robert A. Taft, although he was an actual member of the committee, was tyrannically and rudely refused a request to make a statement to or before the committee about this bill. And the best he could do was to state entirely outside of the committee that this Murray Wagner Dingle Bill of 1945 was the most socialistic measure ever seriously introduced into the American Congress. Now, this is one of the very rare instances in which one of the learned professions in America came to the aid of another profession in a fight against socialism, which would more specifically affect just one of them. In this case, the American Bar Association, contrary to its usual policy, appointed a committee of its own to appear against this bill because the bill was so dangerous, and then insisted so emphatically on the chairman of this committee, Mr. William Logan Martin, being heard, that the committee did not dare refuse him. And Mr. Martin said of the bill in his testimony, quote, "My personal conclusion is that it is probably the most extensive undertaking ever made by Congress beyond the limits of the Constitution of this country. I cannot conceive that a bill which goes so far as this into the intimate details of the lives of American citizens can be justified under the Constitution of the United States," unquote. But none of the solidity and substance of all of this opposition to the bill was allowed to appear in its true light in the publicity concerning the hearings. By very careful stage management, a spokesman of the Communist Party line National Lawyers Guild was called as the very next witness after Mr. Martin, chairman of the American Bar Association's committee. And the rehash by this National Lawyers Guild witness of the Isidore Polk propaganda in support of the bill was given the same weight in the press and everywhere else and by the committee as that of the official spokesman of the American Bar Association. Only 13 doctors, representing the 150,000 members of the American Medical Association and allied groups, which violently opposed the bill, only 13 doctors were allowed to speak against it. But 18 doctors, although they represented organizations with only 3,000 members altogether, and some of those organizations quite hazy, were called to testify for the bill, thus trying to make it appear that a majority of doctors actually favored the measure. Not a single one of the 18 proponents of the bill was a physician in good standing engaged in private practice who was not identified with some communist organization up front. Now, next to the CIO-PAC, the group for the bill, which was supposedly the most influential and played up as such, was the so-called Committee for the Nation's Health, of which Dr. Channing Frothingham of Boston was the chairman. Representatives of this organization were given far more favorable attention by the committee than anybody from the American Medical Association, and the Committee for the Nation's Health was played up by the committee and in the public press as having prestige comparable to or even superior to that of the supposedly self-seeking American Medical Association. It was developed in the testimony primarily by persistent and astute questioning on the part of one freshman senator, Donnell of Missouri, that this great organization, the Committee for the Nation's Health, was supposed to have about 200 members. But its chairman, Dr. Frothingham, testified under oath that he could not remember where the committee met, and that of an executive committee of 10, he could remember only one of them, namely Michael M. Davis. Now, even at that time, some of the rest of us could have told the fuddy-duddy Dr. Frothingham a little more about his committee. Among its chief financial backers was the same Marshall Field, owner of the pro-communist newspaper PM, which I referred to above. Leaders among Dr. Frothingham's some 200 members were, at that time or at different times, Michael M. Davis, Dr. Ernest P. Boas, Dr. John P. Peters, Morris Llewellyn Cook, Mrs. Leon Kaiserling, Anna M. Rosenberg, Edwin R. Embry, Norman Corwin, Joe Davidson, Louis Adamic, Martin Papa, George Sewell, Abe Fortas, Edward Chodoroff, Max Radin, Alfred J. Askis, Sigmund Spaeth, and Maya Porodnik. And the point is that many of those I have named were even then notorious as members of Communist Front organizations. Yet, as I have indicated, representatives of this group were given far more weight than anybody from the American Medical Association. Among the big-shot New Dealers who were paraded forth to testify for the bill and thus to give prestige to its list of supporters in the public mind were Harold Ickes, F.H. LaGuardia, and Secretary of Labor Schellenbach. Under adroit questioning, Harold Ickes admitted that he'd never even read the bill. Here he was there testifying for it. LaGuardia became so muddled that finally nobody could tell whether he was for the bill or against it, and Schellenbach admitted that he was parading as his own opinions that had been prepared for him and given to him by somebody else. There were almost numberless other illustrations of how the force of the Truman administration, tangible and intangible, was put at the disposition of the International Socialists, the ILO crowd, to help them on the propaganda front. But the most revealing of these moves was the letter sent out on December 10, 1945 by Dr. Thomas Parran, Surgeon General of the United States. This letter told all subordinate officers of the Public Health Service throughout the country that, quote, the appropriate executive agencies of the government have been specifically instructed by the President to assist in carrying out this legislative program, unquote. And in effect that every officer of the Public Health Service had better support this program in his public utterances if he knew what was good for him. Now, you can get a pretty good idea, ladies and gentlemen, of just how raw this really was from the fact that 16 members of the United States Public Health Service resigned over it, just gave up their jobs and their careers, rather than even passively accept such dictation as to principle. Now, if you, ladies and gentlemen, think that the measures and movements introduced and still underway to begin, promote, and develop socialized medicine in this country owe their strength to the spontaneous and disinterested support of idealistic people for humanitarian measures, then the conspiratorial planning and trickery behind the Murray Wagner Dingle Bill in 1945 certainly ought to convince you otherwise. At any rate, the same brazen and tricky and conspiratorial strategy and tactics are still being put behind all such legislation intended to lead towards the same ultimate aims, even though some of these supporting activities are conducted much more subtly today than they were in 1945. And if you have any doubts that the whole campaign, then as now, has been conducted by the International Socialists, with the ILO as their spearhead organization for this part of the war between individualism and collectivism, let me give you one more striking illustration. The ILO crowd, despairing for the time being of putting over national compulsory health insurance, and having the patience that never gives up, went to work to bring in the same program piecemeal through both the side doors and the windows. One method was to go into our various departments of government and have them institute their own health programs for their own employees and staffs and everybody else for which they could find any single slightest vestige of excuse. So that today we have your federal government running more than 35 socialized medicine agencies. There are more than 35 million Americans today getting free medical care to some extent and to some level at the expense of the federal government. They have carried socialization of medicine about 25% of the way in this country without the people having any idea of it, and not even a lot of the doctors even knowing or realizing what was happening. In fairly short order, the ILO crowd had got compulsory health insurance accepted and put in force by 5 of our states. The dam was still holding against national compulsory health insurance, but they had broken over here and there to where they had it in 5 states. And in 1949, they presented the same program to the Massachusetts legislature, only slightly disguised in its title only as cash sickness benefits. You may think I am exaggerating when I say that the ILO presented this bill. For the ILO, as we are all aware, does have its headquarters in Geneva. And we are talking about just the legislature of a single state in the United States. But just wait. When the bill was reported out favorably by an interim study commission of the Massachusetts legislature in the spring of 1950, a nosy newspaper man asked to see the bill itself. And the embarrassed committee, which had just reported this bill out favorably, had to admit that they did not even have the bill which they had just recommended and had never seen it. It was coming through later. Actually, the bill was put together in a law office in Lowell, Massachusetts, out of pieces sent to that law office straight from the ILO files. When it did show up, one of the great insurance companies of Massachusetts then analyzed the bill and found in it 21 separate sections of no particular pertinence to Massachusetts, but which were identical in phrasing with sections of similar legislation that had been written by the ILO, prepared for and sent to other states and other countries. There were actually in this Massachusetts bill paragraphs that had nothing to do with Massachusetts or any of our states, but had been copied from the ILO blueprint for such legislation even for other countries. I do take some pride in the fact that I certainly helped to some extent to defeat that bill through making speeches before medical societies exactly as I'm making before you tonight, and through a carefully written letter of some 3,000 words, which I mailed at my own expense to every one of the 7,500 doctors in Massachusetts at that time, and through some other efforts. Today, of course, the ILO crowd have finally got their wedges in the cracks, which they expect eventually, and now rather rapidly, to be opening up all the way, not only for complete national compulsory health insurance, but for the whole nationalized, socialized medical program to gather behind it. They must have asked themselves the question, what on earth could tear at the heartstrings of the gullible and idealistic more than an appeal for an arrangement to provide medical care for sick people who cannot afford it? And they hit upon a smart answer. Why, exactly the same appeal for sick people who cannot afford medical care, but with the appeal simply for those who are not only sick but aged. So these entering cracks have been made, and I offer no prophecy under the pressures which prevail today as to how soon or how rapidly a whole nationalized health service will be brought along behind it. But I do want to point out that medicine, although unintentionally, usually unconsciously, and certainly passively, has largely escaped that ignominy of being the bellwether sheep in the United States. But it can very definitely become in our country an active and conscious leader in the other direction, which helps to turn people back out of the dangerous swamps of socialism with communism just beyond, towards the firm dry land of individual freedom and individual responsibility once again. The great basic theme, excuse, and selling point of collectivism always is security. The word and the concept have so powerful an appeal that many people are willing to pay a fabulous price in other values for even the flimsiest and most visibly exaggerated promise of security. And security is perennially held like a bauble before the masses by ambitious demagogues to beguile the masses into supporting all of the foundation planks on which tyranny is erected. Now, in practice, security is obtained in exchange for one of just two things, for either freedom or labor. And throughout all of history, the trade has almost always been entirely for freedom. In feudal times, the vassal attached himself to the baron, accepted the baron's orders, and lived at the level and on the terms decreed by the baron for the sake of security. Frequently, the baron in turn pledged the same obedience and accepted the same dependence in his relationship with a prince or a king, in order to obtain a corresponding measure of security for himself and his own vassals. The idea of political security goes back much further, of course. In the earliest Oriental despotisms, where individual man seldom had anything to say about the nature or conduct of the government under which he was born, and then even in the Greek city-states, where individual man made his first serious efforts on any sizable scale to determine the nature and power of government for himself. In the European monarchies under the theory of the divine right of kings, in fact, basically in all governments, political security has been the justification given by man to himself for the whole idea of government. And the surrender of the political freedom of the individual for that protection and security, provided or supposedly provided by the state, that surrender was usually complete. The corresponding concept that the state, the government, might or must provide economic security also was far less definite originally, only gradually and occasionally acquired varying degrees of completeness, and first became a serious, extensive, and continuous factor in the whole problem of government in the bread and circuses days of the Roman Empire. But once the expectation or hope had been established in the minds of the masses, this expectation and hope of having economic security handed them has persisted as a recurrent tool of demagoguery ever since. For the masses are not told and do not themselves realize that the only complete security, both political and economic, is in a prison. They don't realize that until some country like Soviet Russia or Communist China becomes just one vast penitentiary, partly by having appealed to this desire for security. And all of this history, ladies and gentlemen, has clearly proved one thing, and this will summarize practically all I have to say on economics. It is far better for an economic system to have 1 million salesmen trying to move the too much than to have 1 million ration clerks trying to divide the too little. Now, the first is the Americanist system, and the second is the communist system. And we think ours is infinitely superior. Unfortunately, over the present and recent decades, the demagogues and power seekers and plain communist criminals who work and advance behind socialism as their ideological front have been pushing us steadily from the Americanist position towards the communist one. They expect to carry us all of the way. If and when they do, then even all of the security they have promised will be a total sham. And every American, including all members of the medical profession, will have given up their freedom entirely in a gradual and insidious exchange for this fraud of security. So what's to be done about it? And why am I putting this picture before physicians? The answer to both questions is very simple. The only thing that can be done about it, to stop this trend, reverse it, and save our country, is to wake up enough of the American people to what is happening, to create enough understanding of the real meaning of what's taking place around them. And we appeal to you, doctors, and to all members of your great profession, to give your mighty help, for here is a place where medicine truly and consciously can lead the way. There are several reasons why you, physicians of America, can become such an extremely important part of the total Americanist educational army. Most important is the influence which you have with your patients. The second is that you already have the mechanical means at hand for helping tremendously in the distribution of educational materials which present the conservative viewpoint, and against which all normal channels have now been so nearly closed by the subtle but ruthless pressures of the collectivists. A third is that your work, your standing, the nature of your service to the community, and the need for that service are such as to make you a little less vulnerable to the attacks and harassments of our collectivist enemies than conservatives in many other professions, positions, or occupations. But there's a fourth and final reason for counting hopefully on so much help and even more help than in the past from members of the medical profession, and this is quite complementary to your profession. This hope is based on experience as well as analysis. For we already have in the John Birch Society far more doctors than we do teachers or lawyers or ministers or members of any other learned profession. What is a stronger point, when we come to chapter leaders and section leaders, the percentage goes up immensely. For while there are exceptions, of course, the very fact that a man has gone into the medical profession is extremely strong evidence of his leaning towards the individualist rather than the collectivist philosophy of life. You have an automatic screening which has already taken place with regard to character, intelligence, conscience, true rather than sham humanitarianism, and love for our country and for the opportunities which it provides for men like yourselves. Not all doctors are patriotic conservatives with a tremendous sense of responsibility to God and their fellow men, but the percentage runs very high. If it did not, I would not be here tonight. For we are in a battle against time, ladies and gentlemen, and we need all of the truly able and dedicated help we can get, and we need it fast. Now, this is in no way a pitch for you to join the John Birch Society, even though we have gathered into the society the finest body of men and women in the whole world today, and even though most of you would certainly be heartily welcomed as members. But this is no such plea would be appropriate on my part, and I refrain, so you see I'm not kidding, I refrain from even asking or suggesting that we have any literature to give out, any introductory material of any kind, or even make any arrangements to mail any to you at all. But it is a plea for you to join the great and growing total force of conservative American patriots who are determined to save our country from becoming simply a smudged carbon copy of so many despotisms of the past. In England today, there are 4 bureaucrats or clerks telling the doctors what to do to every practicing physician. Some of the Medicare proposals already introduced into our Congress, just on the intermediate way to the complete socialization of medicine such as they have in England, would require staff committees to review individual cases, to tell each of you physicians in charge of a case whether or not any further treatment was required. In England, under the completely socialized, bureaucrat-controlled system, doctors with full panels can allow only 3 minutes to each patient, including the time for both paperwork and diagnosis. The whole traditional relationship between doctor and patient has been destroyed, and the whole setup is such an unhappy one for the doctors that hundreds of them are steadily migrating to other countries. But where would or could you gentlemen migrate to if America goes under the socialist chain? We can look around us and see what has happened in other countries. We should be willing to take to heart Santayana's great admonition that those who will learn nothing from history are condemned to repeat it, and learn enough so that we don't have to repeat it. And we hope that more and more doctors, profiting from experience and observation, will join more energetically and determinedly in the great undertaking not only to save your wonderful, wonderful profession from becoming merely an agency of government, but to help all the rest of us to save for our children and their children the whole glorious country and humane civilization which we ourselves inherited. Thank you for letting me go so long.